resolution. And I want to welcome everyone, particularly our guest, distinguished speaker, Professor Richard Susskind, OBE. And I'll do a little intro in a minute, but first I want to thank my colleagues on the programming committee, Colin Rule and Noam Ebner, and the Center for putting on the 22nd annual ADR Cyberweek, and to thank the many sponsors and highlight the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Mediate.com that have played a major role in pulling this off. So without further ado, because we want to get right down to business and hear from our distinguished guest, let me do a brief intro. He doesn't need an intro, but let's take a moment to celebrate just some of his biography. He's the world's most cited author on the future of legal services. He's president of the Society for Computers and Law, the chair of the advisory board of the Oxford Internet Institute, and since 1998, already thinking much into the future at that time, he has been the technology advisor to the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales. He's the founder of the recent Remote Courts Worldwide, which I hope we'll hear a little bit about. And he also importantly has chaired the Online Dispute Resolution Advisory Group for the Civil Justice Council in England and Wales, whose proposals on online courts have been adopted as judicial and government policy, paving the way for many countries in the future. He's written a slew of books, most recently Tomorrow's Lawyers and Online Courts and Future of Justice last year. He holds professorships at multiple universities. And as I close, I just want to say he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the British Computer Society, an honorary bencher at Gray's Inn. And as I mentioned already, he was awarded an OBE, and that was in 2000. And for us, most importantly, he's a fellow of the National Center. And so without further ado, I just want to ask us to give a round of applause to welcome him and appreciate the time he's giving. So I guess if I can turn it over to Colin, who's gonna lead, I agreed to get the most juicy part, which is to introduce and welcome, and I will also join in the festivities of engaging. But I think Colin's gonna help guide the conversation. So I'll leave it now to Colin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leah. And wonderful to have you here, Richard. As you might imagine, we're filled with questions and we're eager for you to take the conversation where you want to take it. But we definitely have a lot of bases we'd like to cover. One of the things I think everyone knows you're a legal futurist, but you get big points for writing online courts in the future of justice right before the pandemic. I mean, for you to have seen that coming, amazing, amazing. But I just wanted to ask, you know, how has it changed the conversation in the wake of the publication of the book? I mean, it must have accelerated things, but at the same time altered the trajectory of where things were headed. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you, Colin. Thank you, first of all, Leah, for your very warm introduction. And as for the book, I could sit back and say, yes, of course, I predicted the pandemic and it was all part of my strategic life plan. But of course, the pandemic's a complete and utter tragedy, which has somehow brought a lot of the work we do into focus. And it's great in a way to be useful rather than, as you say, dreaming about the future. The reality, though, and I just have to be upfront here, is my book on online courts and the future of justice is not really about video hearings, which has been the dominant form of what I call remote court that courts around the world have relied upon during the pandemic. I was looking at one specific form of remote hearing. So I think there's three forms. There's the audio hearing, which is essentially holding a court hearing by telephone conference. There's a video hearing using the kind of technology we're using today. And then there's the paper hearing, where actually there's no hearing at all. It's written submissions, arguments and evidence submitted online, and the judge responds in kind. And in fact, much of my book is devoted really to the paper hearing, to the written hearing, and I call that the online court. I can unpack in more detail. But a lot of the books also deals with the objections to that kind of proceeding. And the reality is my defense of that proceeding is a defense equally for the wider sorts of video and audio hearings too. the truth is, for me personally, and I suspect it'll be true for many of you too, and I was being lighthearted, but suddenly the kinds of things I've been thinking and writing about are center stage for judges. Suddenly they're center stage for policymakers. And so it's been really gratifying to be able to contribute to the conversation, to be in touch with chief justices around the world, with politicians around the world, and suddenly to feel if there's a silver lining to this terrible period, that this might kickstart our greater use of technology. And this is my fundamental point, not simply to automate the way we resolve disputes, but to transform, to allow us to resolve disputes in new and very different ways. And sorry, there's a rather long answer, but I do want to make the point that I think the COVID crisis has both accelerated and decelerated progress in legal technology and court technology. Legal technology and court technology for their first 60 years were really about grafting technology onto our old ways of working. And I call this automation, as I say, systematizing, streamlining, optimizing the way we've done things for years. Transformation, which I believe is going to characterize the 2020s, is the use of technology to allow us to do things, broadly speaking, that weren't previously possible, or to do things that displace and disrupt and replace our old ways of working. Now, in very broad outline, I believe that COVID, both for law firms and for courts, has actually accelerated automation, but decelerated transformation. I don't believe that dropping a court hearing into Zoom is a transformation. I believe it's that the rules of procedure are same. The participants are the same. Just as I don't believe that lawyers working from the kitchen table is a shift in paradigm, what we're doing is using different ways of communicating, collaborating, cooperating, but still within the old model. And so I think we have systematized and been able to deliver our old ways of working more effectively and more rapidly during the COVID crisis, but have actually put the brakes on the more radical kinds of ideas that actually were the subject of my book.
Absolutely. I think I can speak for a lot of people on the call when we've seen the same thing in the world of ODR in the US, where suddenly we've started to use Zoom more than we ever did before. But in a sense, we're paving the cow paths. But I think the optimistic assessment is that Zoom is kind of the gateway drug to greater change. And I think now there's an openness. A lot of skeptics who used to say, over my dead body, I'm never going to do this online. Well, now they're doing video conferencing. So there's a natural next question of, okay, well, how do we take this to the next level?
I think that's right. Although I often say it's open minds and change minds. Many people who in January would have leapt back in horror at the notion of a video hearing are now absolutely leaning in and participating. Mm-hmm. But in a funny way, there's become a new orthodoxy quite quickly that the video hearing is now enshrined, and the only way that one can conduct an alternative kind of hearing to a physical court hearing. It is amazing how quickly I think lawyers and judges have found a new comfort zone. It's also amazing and interesting that we do tend to think of, or perhaps it's just I do, but I think many of us do, of lawyers and judges being very conservative. And in the book I wrote with my son Daniel called The Future of the Professions, we looked at 8 different professions, and other than the clergy, we found the legal profession to be the most conservative. But what's fascinating is during the COVID period, we've seen actually a remarkable adaptability, a remarkable flexibility as judges and lawyers have changed their working practices. So it's not that judges and lawyers aren't capable of change, it's just they're reluctant to do so unless the platform is burning. And unfortunately, metaphorically speaking, that's what we've seen during COVID.
Right. Change often doesn't come unless there's a forcing factor. So mm-hmm. I definitely see that. Now, tell us a little bit about the birth of remotecourts.org. I think it's such a great resource. How did that come about? And what's your aspiration for the site moving forward?
Yeah, it was quite a personal thing, really. I was speaking to our senior judges in early March, and we were contemplating and foreseeing that physical courtrooms would shut and wondering what processes we would put in place. And we were quite advanced over here because we've got a broader reform program where a lot of technologies were already being developed. For example, quite advanced video hearings. But in any event, it occurred to me at that stage, every country around the world, or at least every advanced jurisdiction, would be having similar thoughts and would be wondering how you move from a physical court to a remote court. So I was working at the time and continuing to work on something called Law Tech UK, and I'm president of something called the Society for Computers and Law. And I spoke to the government with a little bit of funding. And within 2 weeks, we essentially put together a website, which we thought would become a focal point, encouraging people around the world simply to send news of what they were doing, to send case studies of their experiences, to send articles of analysis. And quite quickly, we've got over 50 countries around the world at remotecourts.org, and we call it Remote Courts Worldwide. We've got over 50 countries where we can get a fair sense of how they've responded. We've got a little bit of a hiatus, as is the way in life, where we've just been raising some more money to get the next version out, but we will do. My own hope is we can maybe get that up to 100 countries. We can perhaps have some learning resources there, a little more sense of community and interaction and debate over these issues. But we are, I think, engaged here in a global exercise, and you and I, Colin, have discussed this many times before, that we're all motivated to increase access to justice globally. So why reinvent the wheel? Why duplicate effort? Why not share our experiences in this difficult time of conducting remote hearings? And that was the reasoning behind the website. It's pretty cheap and cheerful. It's not advanced, but that, again, is quite an interesting lesson. We put it together in a fortnight. It's the kind of, actually it's less than a fortnight, it's about 10 days. It's the kind of thing, if we'd had advance notice, you could spend 6 months bickering over the logos and the sub-classifications of links and so forth. It just wasn't like that. We just wanted to get something up and running quickly.
Well, that's what we say in Silicon Valley. Launch your minimum viable product, just get it out the door, and then you can sort of build the plane as you fly it. I think it's a very important focal point for the whole global movement. And I do want to widen the lens and talk about sort of the unjustice and areas of the world that traditionally haven't had reliable access to justice, and how technology can transform that. But let me narrow the lens initially. Can you give us the latest on what's going on with online courts in the UK? It felt like there was this huge funding from the government and there was going to be rapid progress, but it seems like things are taking a long time. So I don't know can you give us an update there?
Yeah, I never thought the progress would be rapid. It was £1 billion investment, and originally a 4-year program. I advised and said quite publicly it will take more than 4 years, and that proved to be the case. Oh, that these changes take a lot longer. So I regard it. I've said in my book, I think it takes 10 years to bring about a fundamental technology transformation or digitalization program when all is said and done. We've also had during that period different politicians responsible, different chief justices responsible. We've now got a whole new wave of officials responsible. It's not easy to run a program of that size, but at the heart of it is the idea of some form of online dispute resolution as part of the public court system rather than a private sector alternative. And that continues to be the aspiration. We have actually now a relatively new Lord Chief Justice, and we've got an incoming Master of the Rolls, who's our most senior civil judge, who are both absolutely committed to accelerating progress in this project. But I don't think we'll see fundamental change for another couple of years yet in any event. The commitment's still there. Public sector technology projects, again, I say it in my book, I think it's the case that only 15% of public sector projects, technology projects around the world deliver on time within budget. So it doesn't surprise me at all that it's taking longer. And we'll have, I suspect, continuing battles to get more and more funding. The extent to which it's genuinely transformational, though, other than the online dispute resolution project, I would still question. A lot of our reform program is simply moving from an unimaginably paper-based system to something that's digitized, frankly, in a way that many other jurisdictions have done many years before. So there's some catch-up in trying to get our basic case management, document management, e-filing and so forth in place. There's some catch-up in trying to reduce the size of our physical estate, because if you look at a map of England and courts on it, it looks like it's got measles. And there's an idea of rationalizing, which brings its own, particularly in criminal, has brought its own controversy. So part of this is catch-up. There's also a very ambitious program to try and knit together the various parts of our criminal justice system, our police, our prosecution, our courts, our prisons, our probation service, and to run, as it were, across one information system, bringing them together. And that's a major program, because the English justice system is, for about 50 million people, is a very substantial system in its own right, very hard. I will say hard to change the wheel in a moving car. So if you just imagine the basics are formidable. And on top of that, and we're starting at fairly low value civil claims, we're trying to introduce a whole set of techniques, money claims in the first instance, and that's fully up and running, but we go to eliminate the need physically to gather in the courtroom. So I had hoped, and it raises a very interesting question. I had hoped that we would lead the way in a shorter period of time, but I want you to know the commitment is still there. It's just a big, complex project. And the interesting question it raises is if you compare it to, say, the Civil Resolution Tribunal in Canada, which was far more constrained, contained, manageable project. I think with that, although it is small, and many people will say, well, it's not a court, it's a tribunal, but what we're seeing there is a state-based method of dispute resolution that exhibits many of the features that I think many of us in this call are terribly eager to see in practice. So it's the contrast of the supertanker project, hugely ambitious, bit of a blueprint, trying to transform in one single leap on the one hand, and on the other hand, starting simple, showing that it works, and hopefully filtering up from fairly modest uses in the first instance. Once it gains traction, you could see it permeating the system. They're the two different ways of doing it. And I suppose the theories of disruption would be more in favor of the Canadian system than the UK system. But we've had for a number of years in the UK a kind of a perfect alignment of political will, financial backing, judicial enthusiasm, and broad support from the legal profession for change. And we don't take that lightly, and we've got to capitalize on it. And when you have a large sum of money that's forthcoming from the Treasury, you want to make the most of it. Early days, though, we're at the foothills. And above all else, I suspect this involves cultural transformation that one can't bring about just in a couple of years. It's almost a generational phenomenon. And I don't even mean the next generation, is probably the generation after that. So I'm afraid that in the long run, I always thought this wouldn't be the case. In the long run, online courts are, I fear, a cathedral project. That's to say, no one involved in the beginning of the project survives to see the end. And those who do see the end weren't around at the beginning. But in a way, that's fun. You know, what we're all trying to do in different ways, I hope, is to chip away at the old system where we think it isn't delivering access, and contribute some kind of substitute alternative or something more ambitious. So it doesn't sadden me to think that it's an ongoing, almost never-ending project, but we've all got to, I think, stick to the basic principle that our current justice systems fail to deliver adequate access to justice. We can talk about the details of that, and that technology offers a very promising route, at least to provide some form of palatable alternative.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that concept. Maybe you're like the judicial Gaudi. You know, you started your cathedral and you'll never see the end of it. But I like that. Leah, did you have a follow-up you wanted to ask?
I did. So I was thinking about how several decades ago there was a proposal for creating multi-door courthouses, where the person could walk in and they'd have the option to go to mediation or to go to into court, as an example. And your most recent book and your futuristic thinking for so long now has really even transformed that. So when you talk about transforming the justice system to provide more access to justice through technology, you're also talking about really literally changing the ecosystem and not just having a sort of add-on multi-door courthouse. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to share with those who haven't had a chance to read all of your good works about what you mean by transformation and where alternative dispute resolution fits in that vision.
Yes, I think the multi-door approach was fascinating in its time, in a way pre-technology, and also I think perhaps making the best of an existing set of resources. Whereas the concept of transformation, in my terms at least, is, as I say, allowing us to do things that previously weren't possible. It is fascinating. I suppose we could say of video hearings that before 1990, if we'd had this kind of pandemic, we couldn't have had video hearings. We didn't have the web. But technology, in many ways that we can already see, and in many ways that haven't yet been invented, will allow us to deliver court services in ways that aren't simply automated versions, as I was saying earlier, of how we've worked in the past. But to dip into a little more detail, for me, the concept of online court, there's two fundamental building blocks. The first is what I call online judging, and the second is the extended court. So the idea of online judging is, in the first generation at least, that, as I was mentioning earlier, that you have a judge deciding cases not at an oral hearing, not in a physical courtroom, but by way of evidence and arguments submitted to him or her electronically, perhaps some kind of online exchange between the parties and the judge, again electronically. And I'm not meaning by video, I'm meaning, in the crudest of terms, almost like an exchange of text messages or emails with attachments, the judge coming to the decision, delivering the decision, fundamentally an asynchronous process. Out at the heart of judicial process for the last 150 years, probably 900 years in England and Wales, has been this idea it's a synchronous process. You all have to gather together in one place. That's one of the reasons the video hearing is not fundamentally transformational. It's still synchronous. If we're, for example, in our country, wanting to offer or want to provide a judiciary that's far more diverse, I think the category of person who is available to attend 5 days a week at a particular time, a physical building to dispense justice, is far more limited than the category of person who would be able to conduct an asynchronous process, perhaps a work-at-home parent, for example. So I find this deeply attractive, the idea that the judging is no longer, or not always, a synchronous process, and it's handled very differently. And also that this could be far more proportionate. It worries me that the cost, the timing, the degree of combativeness and so forth of many cases just greatly outweighs the amount at issue. And I think an asynchronous process might be more proportionate. And I can see for some people that's fairly transformational, but the bigger transformation is the extended court. What in a way troubles me most is that most people around the world can't afford access to legal help or legal guidance or legal advice. And so it is bizarre. I mean, OECD say that only 46% of people in our world live under the protection of the law, which means really only 46% of people have a mechanism by which they can understand and then enforce their entitlements. And a lot of the focus that there's been so far on online courts and online dispute resolution has been on the judging side. But unless we have accessible, affordable methods by which people can understand their legal position, we're actually offering a rather empty service, because people won't be able to use this online service. So it'll be in some rather empty sense available and accessible. So what I say in the digital world, we can accept that the primary function of the state in relation to the judiciary is to provide a mechanism for the delivery of binding authoritative decisions. But surely we should go further and provide tools that help people actually to understand their legal position. We should provide tools to help people understand the various options and remedies available to them. We should help tools to help people organize and gather their evidence. We can, I hope, provide tools that can help people actually present their arguments. And all of these are part of what I call the extended court. But more than that, I like the idea, and it's mirrored so much in the world of ODR, that before a case that perhaps is not disposed of at a very early stage by some people simply understanding their legal position more clearly, but there should be an option for some kind of process of negotiation or facilitation or mediation. But the key difference I have here, this is not an epiphany, but I think is a key distinction, is I view that that should be part of, on some occasions, should be part of the court system rather than a private sector alternative. I want that baked into the court system. It worries, although I'm a huge fan of private sector ODR, I also do want our court systems to continue to be seen as relevant, as operational on a daily basis, as a place people will use as a natural first port of call where they're trying to understand and enforce their entitlements. If the court system is pretty much eclipsed by private sector alternatives, I think that does bring into questions big issues relating to the rule of law. So what I'm saying is the extended court is not just a set of facilities to empower individuals who are not represented to be able to argue before a judge online, but also provides a set of tools which we would normally associate as, or term as ADR, that actually be baked into the court system. And I think that's transformational. It's so transformational that many people would argue it's unconstitutional. But again, I try to respond to that kind of challenge in my book. So I think a move from synchronous to asynchronous is transformational in the sense that it wouldn't have been possible without the technology. I think extending beyond judicial decision-making to a wider public service is really something fundamentally new. And we're seeing glimpses of it around the world, but it's early days yet. I keep on saying to everyone, it's early days. We're at the foothills. I've been saying we're at the foothills for 40 years now. I just wish we'd get a little bit further up that hill.
There's a lot of foothills for us to get through before we get in. Well, I want to dive deeper into this because the chat is definitely touching on this. I mean, a lot of what you're saying, I think you've got a very receptive crowd here. You're kind of preaching to the choir. But one area where I think there might be a difference is I think there's a lot more interest in this community to explore these private alternatives. I mean, alternative dispute resolution, it's called an alternative because it's an alternative to the courts. Jim Alamed in the chat asked, to what extent do you see future access to mediation services coming through court filings versus, you know, going directly to mediation without first going to the courts? And one of the things that I would say is the private sector is where this innovation is occurring at light speed, and the courts often slowed a lot of that innovation down. So that may be one point of difference in the ODR community as opposed to the way you framed it.
Yeah, and remember, you know that whole thing about the great thing about principles, there's so many to choose from. Or if you don't like my principles, I've got others. They're both variations of the same joke. I mean, in my heart, I would love our court service to be able to offer these alternative systems. But some of you may have seen, no particular reason you should have, but I wrote quite a long article called The Future of Courts for The Practice, which is Harvard's online publication, which in a sense was updating my thinking of online courts. And I talked there about the possibility, which is consistent with what I say in the book, but I do so with this kind of slightly idealistic reluctance. But I argue there that we should be thinking about private sector front ends, almost some kind of hybrid. And I'm hybrid in a sense I'll discuss in a second, but front ends that allow people to deliver a private sector ODR service, but it's somehow linked to the state system. And one of the linkages, so we're doing a feasibility study of this under our body called Law Tech UK, precisely this issue. And one of the key issues is that of enforcement, about how it is that we can give the bite in the teeth of the public court system that is underpinned by the coercive powers of the state, how we can give that to certain forms of private sector ODR to lend some weight, to lend gravitas, to lend this teeth and bite that I'm talking about. And so we're exploring, we haven't answered it yet, but we've got a project where we've got some impressive people who've grouped together to try and see if we can collaborate with the court. And you'll see in my book, in my architecture, there's a thin sliver of dotted line that allows precisely for this. I remain of the view, and this isn't perhaps a view that's shared with everyone online, I remain of the view that it would be great if the court system could actually provide this kind of ADR baked in the system, but pragmatically, and I don't think it's a great offense to principle, pragmatically, I'm with you, Colin, that we have to face the reality that a lot of the innovation, the imagination, the groundbreaking thinking about new technology is not happening in the public sector. So I'm beginning to think through the idea of some kind of public-private, and this is in the context of UK regulation and law. I'm far less expert, of course, in relation to the US and other jurisdictions, but some kind of private-public relationship. And as I say, I call it a front end, and that's in the hope that it adds, it's some kind of filter. And it goes into the heart of the architecture for me of any good dispute resolution system, which before you get to dispute resolution, you have what I call dispute containment. And that's ways of a whole variety of techniques from discouraging parties from escalating their disputes. And unfortunately, often when lawyers and judges are involved, the process of itself seems to give rise to escalation. But even before you get to the stage of of having a dispute that could escalate, you've got what I call dispute avoidance, which I sometimes call putting a fence at the top of the cliff rather than an ambulance at the bottom. And my premise in all of this is there's very few normal human beings who prefer a dispute well resolved by lawyers to not having a dispute at all. Most people want that fence at the top of the cliff. So why can't we bake that into the system? So my grand vision was, well, the first tier of the online court precisely does this by helping people understand their rights and entitlements. That will often discourage them from going any further. By baking in the second tier some kind of facilitation, mediation, conciliation, early neutral evaluation, we'll have the possibility of containing disputes. And you only go to the third tier, which is of some kind of formal adjudication, if you, as it were, fall through the filter. So that's the broad architecture. So this dispute avoidance, dispute containment, dispute resolution maps onto the three tiers of the online court as I view them.
That's great.
Yes, you're basically saying is with all the will in the world, you're probably going to do a better job of dispute avoidance, dispute containment beyond the public court system. I'm saying I wish it was otherwise, but hey, maybe there's some common ground and we can work together in this.
Well, I like marrying the two. Again, I'm sure you get this in all your talks as well. We had a great question from Amanda in the chat. Do you see a larger role for AI-driven legal advice for currently disenfranchised disputants? I have people asking me all the time about robo-judges. Again, most of the conversations I have with courts, people haven't begun to wrap their brain around how machine learning and artificial intelligence and decentralized justice is going to transform justice. They're trying to figure out, are we going to do e-filing, and online submission of evidence? But just address that. I know you cover it in the book very thoroughly. But
so as you know, Colin, I wrote my PhD in the 80s in artificial intelligence, and that was very much the first generation of rule-based expert systems. Strangely enough, they've come back into vogue. So if you have a look at, for example, again, choosing the Civil Resolution Tribunal, if you look at their Solution Explorer, which is their front end to help people understand their legal position, that is basically rule-based expert system technology. It's not machine learning, but it's nonetheless delivering the kind of concrete diagnostic advice that people need. So I think, was it Amanda? I think it's absolutely right. If you regard it as AI, it doesn't matter what we call it, but I think we will have to have that kind of technology as part of the upper tier of our online court. I don't think that's where machine learning would necessarily come in. I think machine learning at that initial stage of helping you understand your legal position, I think expert system technology is quite suitable there, helping track people through complex regulations or rules and so forth. And so what you'd have there is a distillation by human experts of a complex area of law, a representation of it as some kind of flowchart or decision tree through which other people, less expert, can roam, and out comes the answer. Once you get to the level of the second level, which is the level of alternative dispute resolution, that's perhaps when you'd want some more predictive tools where you'd be using machine learning, which in my kind of case, what's the likely outcome? And so I can see a role for that kind of AI, and this is pre-adjudicative, but helping people contain their disputes. So if you knew in your kind of case that 90% of people or 95% of people were disappointed in the result, then you'd say, well, actually, it just makes sense for me to settle and move on. But the biggest question of all, I suppose, and the one I'm constantly asked, and I address first of all as a law student in 1981, is can computers replace judges? Can AI replace judges? And that can be three different questions. The first question is, can some kind of AI system reason and solve problems and deliver judgments in the way that human judges do? And the answer to that today and for the foreseeable future is emphatically not. Neurophysiologically and neuropsychologically, we have no real understanding how human judges come to decisions, still less the ability to model that or replicate it. Secondly, you might, and in there, incidentally, is what I call the AI fallacy, or my son and I call the AI fallacy, which is the mistaken assumption that the only way you can get machines to do things at the level of human experts' performance is somehow by copying the way that human experts do. It's a remarkably naive and anthropocentric view, but completely pervasive. The reality is that it doesn't seem to me anyway, the starting point should be, let's model the human brain. It's surely what outcomes we're wanting, and can we provide systems that deliver these outcomes? So that then leads you to a second potential question: can a system provide decisions with reasons? Because after all, that's really, I suppose, what judges do. They provide decisions with reasons. And although I and others in the 80s provided and developed diagnostic systems, and you're seeing some of them again today. They only work in very thin areas of law and still remain fairly fragile. None are robust enough, in my view, to provide anything like an authoritative decision by a judge. But the third question is quite different, and this is more looking at the outcomes again. Can we deliver some of the outcomes that courts want by entirely different methods? And so I go, for example, to Brazil, where there's a backlog in the Brazilian case system, court system, of 80 million cases. Now, with all the will in the world, they are never going to be sorted out by human judges, lawyers assembled in a physical courtroom. And so I can imagine, here's a narrative, I'm not necessarily supporting it, but here's the point, or it's a little bit of a thought experiment. Imagine two parties are in dispute in Brazil. The court officials could say, your case will not be heard for 326 years, but we have an alternative. And the alternative is that it just so happens your area of law is one in which we've got many past decided cases, and we've developed a system that actually contains all of these. And it's a predictive model, and it can, in one way or another, suck in the details of your case and offer a guarded prediction of the likely outcome. Would you say to the parties, in the event that this system says its level of confidence in the decision is 97% or higher, would you accept that as a decision of the court, every bit as binding as authoritative as a human decision? Now, I'm not recommending it quite yet, and I can see there's all sorts of shortcomings. We can talk about the opacity of data, we can talk about the bias within data, but it's at least instinctively, it seems to me, if you have no other alternative, it might be a way of us cracking some access to justice difficulties. I don't think we're going to see any of that in the mainstream in the next couple of years. But if you look at some countries such as Singapore, they're already taking this idea very seriously. But often when I speak about this, it then diverts the discussion to questions of AI and so forth. So please do remember my first generation of online courts is still human judges deciding decisions on the basis of the papers alone. But I want to give the AI answer. My general view on AI, incidentally, is that almost all the short-term predictions being made about AI in law hugely overstate its likely impact, but almost all the long-term predictions hugely understate its impact. Will AI transform legal and court practice by 2022? No way. By the early 30s, very, very likely. So this, I think, for all of us, begins to define our collective challenge. I think the 20s will be the decade. And this is me entering my 5th decade of AI in law, God help me. But I think the 20s will be the decade where we will see AI having a profound impact. And it won't, I'll say again, be in replicating, reproducing, streamlining, optimizing, computerizing the way that human lawyers work. It'll actually be delivering the outcomes that court and legal users want in entirely different ways. The little story I like to tell is when I was invited to speak to 2,000 neurosurgeons about the future of the professions, and they asked me to be controversial, and my opening line to them was that patients don't want neurosurgeons. Gasping audience. I said patients want health, and it's no doubt that you're the best solution to the health problem, a particular type of health problem that we have today. But do you not think in 50 years' time, people will look back and think it's unbelievable we used to cut bodies open? Because the future of healthcare is actually non-invasive or minimally invasive, not better surgery or robotic surgery. But we get so preoccupied with how we work, the methods and processes that we use today, that we forget actually the outcomes of the users. And our finest professionals are probably neurosurgeons, and they fall into that trap too. They think the future, when you ask the question, what's the future of neurosurgery? In summary, you're asking the wrong question. The question you should be asking is how in the future will we be solving problems to which neurosurgeons are currently the best answer? So when you ask the question, what's the future of courts or what's the future of lawyers, you are again asking the wrong question. The question you should be asking is how in the future will we be solving problems to which courts and lawyers are currently our best answer? And if you think backwards from that, it takes you to a very different place to thinking forwards from improving where we currently are.
Fantastic. Wow, that's great, Richard. I got one more question for you before we wrap. You note in your book that 54% of human beings on the planet are deprived of the, quote, protections, entitlements, and benefits that the law can and should afford. What's your vision for how the growth of online courts can expand access to justice around the world?
Well, in the final chapter of the book, I have this vision, and I still have it, but it's maybe slightly altered by the COVID experience. But the vision I put forward there is, wouldn't it be great to collaborate? I'm just about to start this, and I've got a couple of big law firms that are going to help fund it. But I was saying, wouldn't it be great if we could have a kind of platform, a tool that could enable jurisdictions that can't otherwise afford or don't have the technological know-how, or maybe even the political will to put a lot of this in place, a platform that could provide a mixture of both a public sector and a private sector dispute resolution mechanism, which would wait to be populated by, in terms of content, by local lawyers, or could provide a mechanism through which, say, online judges, even from all around the world, could help contribute. So my idea was that, and it was born in a way of lots of people coming from around the world saying, would love to see your English courts, would love to copy them. And these are coming from developing jurisdictions. And I was saying, I'm not sure you want to copy this, pointing to our wonderful Royal Courts of Justice. Actually, you've got an opportunity to leapfrog, because I think so much of the future of dispute resolution will be in one way or another online. And they'll respond saying, I'm sure you're right, but we don't have the technology, we've got the tools, we wouldn't know where to begin. Well, I think if we pool our knowledge, we know precisely where to begin. And wouldn't be a huge project to provide a global toolkit that would allow disputes to be resolved, both the public sector and the private sector. And I know, Colin, you've had similar thoughts, but the vision is somehow wildly to increase access to justice. And when I say wildly, in a way, 4% would be enough to take us up to 50%. Because if we could offer access to justice to 4% more people, that would change the lives of several 100 million people, and that would be a good start. And I believe that once these systems gain traction, not only would they be used more widely, but they would affect the way that it is people behave in a jurisdiction that's otherwise, I overstate this, but lawless. I think in a jurisdiction where the rule of law isn't fairly and well anchored within society, the strong will dominate the weak, the rich will dominate the poor, and this would be a fantastic equalizer. So it seems to me that unless we live in a world where there's equal access to justice, so many of the inequalities that worry us so deeply are just going to be perpetuated. So that's the broad vision. I think I'm speaking to Bertie here, but all of us involved in online dispute resolution, I think we can really make a big difference.
Absolutely. And I know when I was in grad school, we studied the first pill problem. And they said the pill to cure malaria, the first pill costs $50 billion to make. But every pill after that costs a fraction of a penny. So we've just got to invent the first pill. Somebody's got to pay for it. And most of the people that are going to benefit from it can't afford the 50 billion, but they definitely can afford the fraction of the penny once we invent it. So hopefully software and the innovations we have in these spaces will get us that scale. All right. With that, I know we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time to speak with us. This is great. We could go on for hours, obviously. We all need to take your class, but we very much appreciate you contributing to Cyberweek. So with that, why doesn't everybody unmute your mic? And if you can say thank you and give Richard a round of applause.
Thank you.
That's very kind.
Thank you.
Thanks for involving me, Colin and Leah. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. And,
Thank you so
I
much.
wish everyone well.
absolutely. Take care, Richard.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully you can join us for the rest of the events today at Cyberweek. We've got a very exciting day, so keep an eye on the agenda. Graham Ross is up next, and hopefully we will see all of you online for our other sessions. So
Thanks.
take care, everyone.
Thank you, Colin. Take care.
See you soon.